Va a hablar Anwar Shaikh. Anwar Shaikh es profesor de Economía de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales y Política de la New School University, editor adjunto del Cambridge Journal of Economics, becario senior y miembro del equipo de modelos macroeconómicos del Levy Economics Institute de Bard College desde 2000 al 2005, autor de varios libros y artículos sobre diferentes temáticas económico-financieras, como por ejemplo globalización, mitos del libre comercio, la depresión del siglo XXI, entre otros. Anwar.
Let me start by thanking Governor Marco Del Ponte for inviting me to this, I think, momentous occasion. She's already eloquently laid out the central issues for Argentina and for economic theory, especially the economic theory of central banking. And of course, Jamie Galbraith has equally eloquently laid out the U.S. side of that same set of issues and the role of the U.S. in the export of the financial crisis. So what I'd like to do here is to focus instead on more general questions of economic theory, of economic history and policy, and specifically, at one point at least, on the export of U.S. economic orthodoxy. Because the crisis is not merely a crisis of the export of financial policies, it's also a crisis of the export of economic theory. And so we need to focus a little bit on that. I think one point to be made is that the Central Bank of Argentina has made a momentous step, in my opinion, by stating clearly that one cannot coordinate economic activities through just one instrument, that inflation is not the only property of an economy that should be of concern to a central bank. And I'm happy to say, Jamie's already pointed out, the Federal Reserve has long had this, but the Federal Reserve, the governor of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, has recently admitted that Governor Marco Del Ponte is correct. And so for once we have the US following Argentina, not the other way around. And I think that's an important step to recognize. In Europe, it's widely recognized also. Central banks are helpless in the face of the consequences that they have to deal with. And so, once we get to that point, to understand that, we have to also talk about the fact, let me back up a bit, I forgot something. I was at a conference where, I'm not allowed to quote who that was, but let's say it was a former governor of the IMF, who said, in public in 2008 that we were misled by the economic models. We were misled by the economists. Well, of course, that's because that governor was listening to the orthodoxy of economics and to those models which were related to the orthodoxy, and he himself admitted there that what we need to do is to open up the discourse, open up the discussion so that we have a more debate and more openness. And that's a theme that I want to emphasize, is that the issue is not of replacing one model with another, but opening up the debate so that people can take a stand on the logic and the theoretical and historical and empirical coherence of their arguments. And I think this hasn't been lost, as many people have pointed out, in the last 30 years. And here the US has played a dominant role in erasing historical memory of alternatives, and that is something that I'm happy to say is being rejected in many parts of the world, even in Europe, unfortunately not in the US yet, but certainly in Argentina, in Brazil, and in parts of Asia. So what is this vision that has been challenged now? I think that it's a recognition that unregulated markets behave in a way different from textbooks and different from models, World Bank models, IMF models, central bank models. What are these points? One is that the market system produces optimal outcomes through flexible prices. That's one of the standard presumptions of the standard theory. The second is that it produces full employment through flexible real wages. That's another central assumption. Third is that it can produce price stability through flexible monetary policy, which is in fact then becomes a sole function of the central bank, because after all, the system is already optimal if prices are flexible. It's already full employment if real wages are flexible, so the central bank has little to do except to keep an eye on inflation. It is from these theoretical roots that we get the standard prescription of central bank policy, but of general economic theory and policy, and it is, I guess, one of the beauties of science that you can theorize about how the world works, but the world does not have to be impressed by your theory. And capitalism made it very clear that it was unimpressed and delivered a resounding slap to the theories, a slap that is echoed so loudly that even directors of central banks all across the US and Europe have come to recognize that they are being stuck with a theoretical foundation which is unsound. Now, this would have come at no surprise at all if it was a standard part of the training of economists to look at economic history, because that history makes it very clear that the patterns of recurrent booms and excessive financial development and then periodic contractions and crises are normal. One of the arrogance that of modern economics has been to say that that was in the past, because they were, of course, not as clever as we are, and so therefore it's all past. I, for one, have a somewhat less kind view of the development of economic theory, which is that it's like the law of entropy. It constantly declines in general levels of ability and leads towards disorder. The apparent order is a disorder. But in any case, it's very important to understand that there were excellent understandings of how the system works, and these understandings are capable of being applied to modern economic events. Not by simply reading textual things in a biblical fashion, but understanding the conceptual structure of that and using modern tools and modern evidence to develop that conceptual structure. So we need nonlinear dynamics, we need econometrics, we need agent-based simulation, we need statistical thermodynamics. Those are just tools. Their application requires a systemic understanding, and that understanding will be different than orthodox economic theory. It will have a different reading despite the use of the same tools. Much of my work has been devoted to developing an alternative, which I would like to talk about a little bit at the end. But anyway, to say that these alternatives have been around for a long time, and it is not a matter of reinventing them, but understanding that the kind of theoretical closure that took place in the last 30 years and the opening that is now taking place, we have to widen that opening. And the way to do that, in my opinion, is to encourage more debate. Science proceeds by debate, and debate is uncomfortable, it's unpleasant, it can get noisy, and that is all good, because that's how ideas should develop. Let me talk a little bit about the actual account of the crisis. If one looks in the history of the system, of the capital system, one sees the word Great Depression recur many times. And each time we are taught to forget it, or we're taught that anyway, it happened because in the past people didn't know how to do things that we now know. There's some truth to this, we know a lot more, but we also know a lot less. That's something to understand, that we've lost something. There's an event called the Great Depression of the 1840s. That was a period of great turmoil in the advanced capitalist world. And here I'm speaking only in the advanced world because I want to emphasize the point that this is intrinsic to the center. It is not something that is just restricted to developing countries, but it's always been part of the most powerful countries of the world. Then there is a great historical event. Everybody who studies economic history and business psychology knows that event is called the Great Depression of 1873, or the Long Depression of 1873, because the usual historical timing for that event is 1873 to 1893. Then, of course, there was an event called the Great Depression of the 1930s, and we know that this happened in the center, and that it lasted at least until the 1940s, when the war pulled countries out of it, or at least cemented the recovery out of it.